In nearly every war, their greatest enemy is fear. Fear makes us fight unnecessary conflicts, it makes us prolong short battles, and it makes us turn on one another. During World War II, once Japan had bombed Pearl Harbor and showed victories in battles, America had seen them as an unpredictable threat to be afraid of. In their desperation, America had begun to turn on their own people under the guise of preemptive measures. America had deemed that the potential threat of espionage was greater than the immoral act of imprisoning the entire race of Japanese Americans into concentration camps. Japanese Americans suffered more than most others who were impacted by the Great Depression and World War II, as they were taken from their previous lives and forced into isolated camps with limited resources and money, leading to many losing their identity as an American and seeing themselves as failures. They initially tried to challenge the government's order in court and through protest, while they ultimately combated the inequality by serving with distinction in the military and found some success. Firstly, during the Great Depression and into World War II, Japanese Americans faced profound economic dislocation that deeply changed the way success and failure are viewed and therefore challenged their perception of a fully American identity. A number of Japanese Americans in the Northwest during the early 1930s, despite pervasive discrimination, carved out economic sectors for themselves and created political organizations to manage their social business and affairs. Yet, as economic pressure mounted, they were hit hard by joblessness and failing business revenues. Employment discrimination doubled in intensity, and Japanese Americans, the state's largest minority population, had built a thriving small business sector. Now, many of those residential hotels and restaurants struggled for customers. Then, with the outbreak of war, things escalated quickly. Racial economic anxiety contributed to the mass internment of Japanese Americans, but what's frequently overlooked is the role of racialized economic anxiety in drumming up support for the mass incarceration. Taken together, these economic upheavals show that Japanese Americans' conventional markers of American success were severely disrupted. The consequences were therefore hardly limited to economic stability and were extended to their definitions of success and failure in the context of the American identity being rewritten around them. War and economics consequently combined to cast many Japanese Americans into a space of failure under American norms, even though they sought to claim success on their own terms. Additionally, even with being taken from their homes, thrown into internment camps, and placed under strict supervision, they faced constant discrimination and some were branded as traitors. In 1943, the U.S. wanted to use second-generation Japanese Americans called Nisei to create a new combat unit, but were unsure as to determine the likelihood that a U.S.-born Nisei being considered for military service would be loyal to the United States or to Japan. The loyalty questionnaire was created for this purpose and was administered to all adult Nisei men. When those that are old, disabled, and had children were asked if they would leave and fight in the war, of course they said no. Anyone who answered no to questions 27 and 28, which asked if they would serve in the military and remain loyal at all costs to America, were marked as disloyal, and they and their families were sent to Tool Lake, a high-security concentration camp, and were called no-no boys, who became ostracized by others due to their image and by other Japanese Americans who emphasized proving themselves through military service. Furthermore, a few men had gone against the internment camps and were jailed. However, they took the issue all the way to the Supreme Court, arguing that the government's actions were unconstitutional because they discriminated against Japanese Americans based on their race. Many argued that being forced into internment camps violated their rights. However, courts ruled that the potential threat outweighed even the Constitution. One justice who sided with Korematsu had argued that due to the fact that throughout history, the Supreme Court had upheld and validated multiple cases of racial discrimination, which can then be used as an excuse for any new authority, such as military in wartime, to use that fact like a weapon against the people. Overall, Japanese Americans had to deal with discrimination and being wrongfully accused of being disloyal and forced to live in essentially a prison even after they were forced out of their own homes and lost all of their assets and their livelihood. Finally, fueled by a desire to regain their American identity and loyalty to America, many Japanese Americans participated in World War II. Initially, they were not allowed to join the war effort due to the new espionage laws. Shortly after, they were allowed to serve, and over 33,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry enlisted in the war, in which over 20,000 joined the Army. The 100th and 442nd Combat Team and the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion consisted mainly of Japanese American Nisei. Many volunteered to fight in the war based on the devotion to prove their honor for America and show their loyalty. One such soldier, Noboru Seki, fought with immense devotion and recalls his parents saying, "This is your country, you defend your country, even if you have to die for your country." Seki listened to his parents and supported America with all his might and adopted the phrase, "go for broke," which is fight with all you have. Instead of fighting against America for revenge, the Japanese Americans fought for the country to convey the true spirit of the American identity, always facing up to the struggles and taking action positively. Seki explains how he did not particularly know why he stayed in the war after his experiences of tirelessly digging up trenches in brutal conditions and also being trapped in a dark, rainy, miserable, heavy pine forest. The deep devotion towards America and the willingness to fight for both the country and to achieve their own freedom describes their will to be a part of the American identity. The conditions of the war may have been ferocious, but the effort paid off. It was won, and the Nisei were able to return to the West Coast. After the war, Japanese Americans split into two different economic groups, one that had enough capital from before the war where they could easily integrate back into society, and those that lost everything in the camps and became scouts, who spent many years to fully settle and feel they fit back into American life. However, as the results of the unfair decisions of the US government, there was initially short-term anti-Japanese discrimination were against the Issei. Overall, Japanese Americans fought in the war to prove their loyalty and devotion to their country, and through their success, they were celebrated and, for the most part, returned as a part of the American identity. Ultimately, while millions faced dire circumstances as a result of the Great Depression, World War II, and the struggle of identity in America, the Japanese American experience was one of the worst. They were evicted from their homes, stripped of their businesses, and herded into camps, all of which completely shattered their sense of American identity. They were seen as potential disloyalists, which meant that the institution of the government, including the military and the police, treated them more as potential threats to national security than as citizens. Yet Japanese Americans resisted, time and again, in courts and community, and finally with voluntary military service in a unit that eventually became known as the 442nd, and they showed loyalty in ways no other Americans had ever been asked to question. Their story ultimately shows how war and economics can redefine the lines of who has the right to be included and considered American, and how reliant success and belonging can be on fear rather than justice. In reflecting on this history, we have to acknowledge how rapidly rights can be stripped away when a nation associates identity with suspicion. And more importantly, we must confront this behavior head-on to prevent this discrimination from ever happening again.